Today we're going to demonstrate replacing the old version of the T8045 bias rod assembly with our new version. First, you need to remove all the diaphragms from the pump before we can get to the bias rod assemblies. Next, you need to remove the spool valve. You don't need to remove any of the other components of the diaphragm assembly, just the spool valve, because the rest of the diaphragm assembly will remove when we remove the bias tube. There's the spool valve. Next, you need to remove the diaphragm plate screws from the diaphragm plate. Remove the diaphragm plate and lower it to the ground on a clean piece of cardboard. Remember, the diaphragm plate weighs 100 pounds and is a two-man lift. Next, hammer out the bias tube. You're going to insert your bias tube into the diaphragm plate, and you need a metal dowel that will give you some extension for when you hammer it into place. Take a hammer and hammer in the bias tube until you clearly hit the stop. After inserting the bias tube, inspect the inside of the bias tube and clean out any debris if found. This is the new bias rod assembly. You have a new bias rod that has a mechanical stop here to prevent travel, and the spring has tangs at either end that helps in the easier assembly. So you can see the tang there and the cap, the tang here. Those tangs keep the part from rotating as you're screwing in the diaphragm clamp from the front. Take the bias rod assembly, insert it into the bias tube. And to tighten it, take a 30mm socket and tighten it down. Insert the spool valve. Take your diaphragm clamp, get it into position. Take the diaphragm clamp screw. You need a 5mm Allen wrench. Tighten to 20 foot-pounds. To check for proper assembly, use the follower screws to verify the diaphragm clamp's full range of motion. Over-tightening of the M8 screw, as shown here, can cause the internal components to bind. By checking the motion of the diaphragm clamp, you can verify that you have not over-tightened the screw. If you've over-tightened the screw, you won't be able to move the diaphragm clamp. Put the O-ring into the follower. Take the follower, put it into the diaphragm. Insert the diaphragm with the backup ring into the diaphragm plate. insert the follower screws. Tighten them using a 4mm Allen wrench. Next, slide on the manifold. Caution, the manifold should slide cleanly onto the pump and the backup ring should be engaged in the mating grooves. There should be no clearance between the manifold and the diaphragm plate. If the backup rings are not in the mating groove, there will be a clearance. If there is a clearance and you tighten the manifold nuts, you can crush the backup ring, which will cause the pump to leak. If you're having trouble assembling the manifold, use a piece of fine emery cloth to break the edge of the groove. That concludes the bias rod assembly demonstration. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Warner Engineering.